On the Jambanya she kissing Karishevades and the Lu Jambanya, Sim Jambanya, and the Che Jambanya, and the Korea Shisavade. Isn't that Jambanya she and you? And the Daddy share the Lam Yung or you begay, and Lam Yamlin chicken to you, Lam Yung or you be Jambanya Shigore, and Dela Kanishla was name, Mipatile Luda, Soadas, Sam da Che Kaya Roachil Mine. And Digala, Mibati, Miche, Teleti, Dedo, or Casore, Ranget Sini, the Chi Sini, Nini Pa, Jebache, and that Gombi, Jambata, Sheriff Karangu Dupike, Lamjuki, Chembatela, and the Jambanya said, on those chine, and Wasungorwa, the Nenzada, kissing on the shitty she sum she sare, that didn't answer you at ma, Chedden Banyasha, Digor Mashiashi.
Good morning. We're continuing to look at the presentation on the 4 close placements of mindfulness. And from the entity which in our text is outline D, it says it's an exalted wisdom. So therefore, an actual practice of a 4 close placement, or an actual practice of a close placement of mindfulness is done by someone who has achieved a path. And the entity continues, or the definition continues, engaging in practicing a path included in mindfulness and wisdom, having investigated the general or specific characteristics of any of the 4 body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. So of those 4 observed objects, we've looked at body, feelings, and mind, and today we'll look at the 4th one, that of phenomena. And as before, this is approached through the same way of investigating with both mindfulness and wisdom through first the specific characteristic and thereafter the 4 general characteristics.
Na zugula Jambanya Sha said the Kim Meva in a Lam Yung or Gule, Majeva in a Chidanga Zugula, Jambanya Sha, Comia Yoribes in a Jambanya Sha, Comia Yorwada.
So the text is presented 4 practitioners who have achieved a path in their continuum and how they can engage in the meditation on the close placement of mindfulness. However, for those of us who aspire to a path, certainly we too can engage in such meditations, and moreover, we should engage in such meditations.
Jambigi Tiane, you did a teacher the nation Bangane, and Delia, and the sheriff Jebache, Komagi, Kishigora, the names that they are to Jambanya, she do, Konzo, Yushine, Topsaranja, Yashigora, Chizan Jambatita, that's one thing you think it's in the key, and they got over a Shine Chadi or what Shine Chadi or what the thing is in. Shine Topsaranja, Kishigora, the names of Konzo, you tell a Jambit senior, and the same teacher near Top near. Neje di tene la shede ke cheba chine komgorwa dang ang zo da yu la zeji de be ding yin ji ma to ba yin za nga zo le zhen ban sha da di ge she ngwe ne di nga zo ge la yo ma ro.
Whilst we can and should engage in the practice of the 4 close placements, we will not be engaging in an actual close placement of mindfulness because we have not achieved a path in our continuum. And amongst the various differences between a being who has achieved a path and one such as ourselves who has not, amongst those various differences, we will not hold the observed object with calm abiding, as we have not achieved calm abiding. So we will use mindfulness, but mindfulness that is not conjoined with calm abiding, whereas an actual practitioner who has achieved a path will necessarily have achieved calm abiding, and thereby their mindfulness will be conjoined with calm abiding.
gom sedi da kar zulya semya namdo mongbo da semya majiba mongbo dunga mongbo le da denigi dunga shiya da semya lele yaya don da la ngazoge jamanya sha gom ya yorwa da.
But for ourselves, who haven't achieved the path, still this is a practice to engage in, as it's a very effective technique to overcome our mental problems and difficulties, and rather to achieve a desired state of mental calm, of mental peace.
Dene zadang zuini jambanya sha komyo de mibadi dangbo mibadi ngo song go ra da mibadi ngo song che dene mibang ngo mibadi la sem che chi de che gom go sha go ra ji da mibadi la nga zu lu le mina de go ro chowa le mina de go re su su yi an u le mina de go da mibadi da ma ra yong chu go ro.
So for ourselves, we, just like those who have achieved a path, need to first know what the observed objects are, and thereafter how to meditate on them. And so for ourselves, we can, the observed objects are the four that are presented here, but within that, one can approach it in many different ways, focusing on the body, focusing perhaps just on breath, focusing on feelings, and so forth.
Semlia chowa le mi bai na so lia chowa kan de xiong du san be ge da chowa rang le da je gabrilia na ji ge chowa dunga jwa be na dunga de la da de ko mi da ji de ni ge chowa de wa jwe be na de wa ji ra de wa le mi je chowa rang sam da je ane so su ge nyong ye ge dang bo chowa di gan s nyong gu du semlia na chowa nyong da chowa di nyong di dang bo ngo song dene sem ngo song ne dene chowa dene xiongdu sempe liang de dene dele ya jambe jin je chowa dele pa jambe den jin je yu di mi sheba de chowa de rang mi je de jambe ge pa jin dene sem dele number shan le ma yang wa je dele ze ji du da ne de ne de bi ge sem se wu ji ge chowa dele pa da jen dene ge ne sem ya de nu ba ye de gen se wu ru jen ne chowa de tong de gen ru je sem dene samdang semde nuba yuhenji sewu che dene nga zu dene ge do chen dan kom de be na dang ju ge de chowa yu mi ba chowa le mi ne an dembe jin je semde ding yin de le je ji do ne je samdang za di ko me de nga ju tan ba ye ja kom ba sa ji ji xie shu go ba da.
A very simple way that we can do this meditation is with regard to the observed objects of feelings, just observe whatever feeling we are experiencing. Sometimes we'll notice that the feeling of happiness or a pleasant feeling has arisen, just observe that. Or a suffering or unpleasant feeling has arisen, just observe that. Hold it with mindfulness as well as another mental factor of stabilization. So with stabilization, mindfulness, just hold that feeling in an undistracted way. In this way, observe whichever feeling has temporarily arisen.
Shogor wadang du sin sem de de ma to ba che nen pa sho ru ko che zan de ya shi xin gi de ni ge jamba de mi ba de le ma de ba zhe ji de ne ma to ba jin ma to ba che xian le de sho gu de sho sem de zhe ji de yu cho wa de le ne ma to ba che sho gu de sho mu de sam da de pa ji sho gu de sam ba na sho ba ha ko wa da ne sho gu de sam ba yin na de ne yang jamba de ge pa shi xin de ha ko de den bi yu cho wa de lian jin go le mi the
mental factor of mindfulness needs to be utilized with its companion mental factor of introspection. This is a key companion to mindfulness. Mindfulness serves to hold the object. Introspection serves to ensure that the object is being held. So the purpose of introspection is to observe vigilantly. So this mental factor that I translate as introspection is sometimes translated as vigilance. And this too presents its function. It's vigilant in terms of being aware of whether mindfulness is holding its object or not. And as soon as introspection notices that one's attention has wavered from the object, then introspection alerts mindfulness, which re-engages the object, brings the attention back to the object. So these two, mindfulness and introspection, need to be utilized together. Introspection vigilantly watches the mind, and as soon as it notices the mind has wavered or awareness has wavered from the object, it alerts mindfulness, which then re-engages the object.
And 당한 저기 유들을 소화들 제시도 내겐데 딩이 진지로와다. 지산 딩이 진딩한 저기 샘디 유 제시도 내디 내투메 완자 니 약원 내투야라 잼베기 유들이야 진고고 야네 진고고라 파 미바데 마쇼하지 잼베 진용도 안텔레 딩이 진디 텔이야 내게 내차이데 아주 유를 제주 내게 차들라 셰바들 딩이 진세로와 디네게 돈달라 잼베 유디 진되겐데라 잼바시고로와 지산다 잼바스 유디 진되겐데라 제마조 진되겐데라 잼바제 데네 제지도 네되겐 삼로 젤레 띵게 진제 다디 네그도에 민도 파제바치겐디 하고 다한디 시신세고다 시신 지산 잼바 시신 띵게 숨거 호거다 등하서 잼바니 셰콤데 유디 진디레지 제마 주바지 파 진디겐 진디 이거서 템바디기래가래 다 유디 진디 진거를 가르치네 샘띵이 진디 될래야 띵이 진디 유디 제지 네 투고 말아 네 투여게 돈다 유디 맞제바지 잼비기 진투고래 디 지나당 데니게 진디도 qab라다 야체게 유띵이 진디 유디 파 샨다 쇼기도 맨나메 리그도 다한디 시신들이 지난 디기 시신에 다 잼베 유디 진 디니게 다 샘 띵이 진디 유디를 제주 네트워크에 덮치고로 와 디공고라 다디 담마이서 검사 디공고라 안디니게 검야 차이고로.
So let's talk about the role of three mental factors and present it very clearly what their differing functions are. Mindfulness serves to ascertain the object. That's the role of mindfulness. Then there's a second similar mental factor of stabilization, sometimes translated as mental stabilization. And this holds the object stably, ensures that the object, mindfulness ascertains the object, then stabilization holds that object stably. Then there's a third mental factor of introspection, which vigilantly observes what is happening, ensuring whether stabilization has lost or not, whether stabilization is continuing to hold the object or not, and if it loses the object, introspection alerts mindfulness to re-ascertain the object. So this is how the three, mindfulness, stabilization, and introspection work together. Mindfulness, ascertaining the object, stabilization, holding it stably, and introspection, ensuring that that is being done.
And in the Jisangazo Jambanya said, Jambig Yudi, Chin, Chetela, there's some Tama Shangala, some Mata, there are some Tadio or Lagadu, you did things in the Techi to utilize no Sigurwa, and it's just things in said also Kishigo Martina, you did a Jamba Tenji, you shandak, I am muscle you, so Koran, Taji Jambig Zindu or Lagadu, tell the Jambit to same the things in Della Techi to nature or what, and that did it. Just not the Lagato, the Yudi Karchigors and Jambadiki Chico, Jambadiki, Zoro, Yudi Zinje, Jema Della Zinje to Chidu. Jambadja, the Jambanya Shas, or Zodi, Conchivenza, could make it Taji, and Jambanya Shas.
So I want this to be clear because our text just talks about mindfulness and wisdom. Mindfulness in our text is explicitly mentioned, but implicitly mindfulness also includes stabilization. So it's not, stabilization isn't at all, not once specifically mentioned in the text, but want to make sure that the three differing functions of mindfulness, introspection, and stabilization are clear. So mindfulness ascertains the object. That's the role of mindfulness. Stabilization holds it stably. And then introspection guards or ensures that the object hasn't been lost, that the object is still being held stably. And it's introspection that notices that the object is being held stably and notices when it is no longer, when the awareness has wavered from the object. And then it's introspection that alerts mindfulness to re-ascertain the object, and thereby stabilization to hold it stably once again. So in our text, when we see mindfulness being referred to, we should understand that it also infers stabilization. So the function of both together, although only mindfulness is explicitly stated.
Sula miche Jamanya Comda, Soso Soala miche Jamanya, Soso Uliat Mina Jamanya Comma, the Gablish and Jamanya Coms, the Tincom said, Jamba di Udara, Michanda, some Guinea, Udara, Zejidu, Zula Bimban, Sukorona Zejidu, some Sukorona sometimes. Chizan Shanda sometimes charge it is a super Zejidu sometime. This sometimes the Jambi Zingor, you the Jamba Zinja, Jambi Chesona, the same detail station the two marriages, Jambi Zin Dugorwa. Zin Duje and Delia and the same station near. Chisa Dineshi Duan, same Namdo, Jugideshi, same Damara Jada, Denigi Jigit, Toa Damara, Noya, same Ganga Busto, Chazan Dushin, Pumbo, Sulmi, and Zukorang, sometimes Shanghai, some other same detail Zejidu, Dingis in the Dela Zejidu, near Jambi, Ziji, Neji, near Dudu. To near the dinner, Jugideshi Namdo Damal, Jigli, she to Gorwa. She on the dinner assembly, and Jikanga, Jukanga, Namdo Mara Semna, Mara Chadination, and Semna Kanga Maki Chegorwa. Says a dinner, Zejidu, near the dinner is March, the Jigi do she do, Sem the Derma, Jambets near to Shanda de Jengimeva, Majamba Sugorwa. Dinner is the Nigi Namdo Sem Tamara Samedima, Meva, Yedu, Yedu, Dene, Semnikan Meba, Leshi, Chagorwa, Odinga to get the Mishine Comna, Casore, Casore, Jamanesha Comiate, Comiate in the Sigurwa.
What I've been presenting here in these last few segments is more in the context of how the term mindfulness is used in society in general these days, where it's used with an object of observing the breath or observing the feelings. So this is how it's generally used in society, and this serves an important purpose in that when in society that there's talk of mindfulness practice, behind this term mindfulness, or included with this term mindfulness, are the additional mental factors of stabilization and introspection. So it tends to only be the one that's referred to, but all three are utilized. And the purpose of practices, or the benefit of a practice such as mindfulness in the way that it's utilized in society, is that so much of our mental anguish comes from over-rumination or discursive thought, our mind being so distracted, going from one thing to another, making our mental problems ever larger. So practicing mindfulness in the way that it's presented in society helps calm the mind, in that all this rumination, this abundance of discursive thought that causes us such stress and anxiety, this starts to calm. The mind starts to become a little bit more focused and a little clearer. So in this way, it helps ease the burden of mental suffering for beings. So this is the purpose and how it's utilized in society. And that serves a good purpose. However, that is not what is meant by an actual practice of a close placement of mindfulness, whether it's by someone who has achieved a path or by someone who aspires to achieve a path. The actual practice of a close placement of mindfulness, as we've been seeing in this text, is quite a lot more profound.
Ante yudi semdi denma chik yuwa ne yudi pungpo le mi du che namdo chasan hi yodu ane nga sem pungpo di yudi ya sebu ma thongwa che sem di ya naktom dom ro che cha yongwa ya chik yonggu ro wada di yoba ne di mindfulness kasore jambani ja komya takta cha go mare karsa mukpa se de li yore jezan denege naktom dom sem dile yudi pungpo de sebu ro che ma thongwa che 아니 나톰 직시다 아니 샘 코로나 뉴버르지 메디게 나톰 차야도 안디 묵바세 레사레 디 간족에 잠바니자스 고미야세 따다 차고 말에 디레서나 아니 가슴 제길리길리 제레 니후용그래 지산디 묵바게 되네 니후용그래 지산 데네기 차바나 유디야 세보라 마통 샘디야 나톰 노라 직제데 도 스테데 바이나 문테 스테투레 데니젠 글리진데 니후레 지산 데네 여반 삼 데네 레베나 디 가서 잠만이죠 고미야데 딱다 차고 말에
This way of practicing mindfulness in society does serve a very useful purpose of slowing down this process of over-conceptualizing or discursive thought, bringing the mind to a stiller place, making one feel a lot more peaceful and relaxed. And that is needed in our modern society. However, it's very likely that unless one is skillfully guided, one will remain in this peaceful, relaxing state, but the mind will actually not be very clear. It will be quite foggy, quite sleepy. And this, therefore, and in such a case, whilst the meditator may feel very relaxed and peaceful, this is not an actual practice of mindfulness because the mind is not becoming clearer, but rather becoming dull and foggy and sleepy.
안데네시 요소가 당하는 쪽에 데데 나는 쪽에 도스제네 직삼당 고무라 직전에 데네 이 도스리기요 바데가 소소라기 냠뇨터네 하고도 부르와 당하는 쪽에 징념도 제된 가시 쉬어봐네 안도스테 로고디 글리즈네 가시 도스테 니고디야 용구로 와데네 지데 디 가르스네 무발리고레 무발렌데네 니리고데 담마니 쇼고미아데 다다 마차 마차바레.
So therefore, I encourage you in your own practice, if you do a daily mindfulness practice, just to watch your mind and see whether, whilst a more peaceful and relaxed state of mind is certainly welcome, if your mind is also becoming foggy and sleepy. If this is the case, then you need to get further guidance, because this is not the desired outcome. So it is certainly desired to tame the mind, control the mind, to calm this over-conceptualizing, but not to fall into a foggy, sleepy state. That's not the purpose of meditation.
Ludilea, Chimicha Jin, Duba Yimba Chilla, and you Koran Lolia Nai, the Sevurish, not Dubina, Sem Korolia, Nuba Shuk Medic and Arm Kuni Medic and Yunguris, you are your Suda, and then he combined Diam and Jidan to Chiduban, Di Mangura de Tugo, Nikugo Mare, Sem di Yudi Zingor, Yudi Sem de la Nangor, in a Sem Koran Nushu Medic and a Chingorwa, Nushu Medic, Sem de Yudi, Simba, Nikugo Mare, and those Durban, Namdo Chazan, Shanda Chazan, Gache, Sem Lushishi Rachada, and then Chagor, in a Sem di 유디 세우치나 아니 숨는 뉴슈다 가로지 슈로지 용거 매바래 지산디 내내 여바나 디소 진화세야 시 용을 당하주기 디야 내가 주기 담반이샤 거미야기 제 야가란데 제거 말다 내내 되번 샘려 잠비가 유디 진세지도 네 되바 임바지야 다 내내 지도 남도 차상 시대 샘려 회시시라도 용구래 이나다 잠바디기 유디 지해 유디 세부다 지해다 유디 진비게 나 니바로 시라메티가 지금 거래서도
So I just want to correct my translation here. Most of what was said was correct, but I'll say it all again and you'll see there's a bit left out. So what we need to guard ourselves against, if your practice is one of mindfulness, is that if the mind is becoming peaceful and relaxed, this is certainly welcome, but ensure that it's not becoming foggy and sleepy and dull, because this is a state of lethargy. So here, on the positive side, the mind is relaxed and peaceful, but one's mind is lethargic, foggy and dull. And also one is likely maybe to doze off and therefore not be able to meditate too long. So this is one fault to guard against. So earlier I mentioned about the object and its clarity. That was an error. Again, I didn't say anything about it there. The other fault that one can fall into, so that was the fault of lethargy. The other fault is laxity. So laxity is quite different. One's holding the object, and one may have feel that one has good concentration and one will observe the object with clarity, but the mind lacks strength. So in this type of meditation, one is not sleepy at all. One can actually remain with the object for a long period of time, but the mind lacks strength. So this too is not the desired outcome. This is the fault of laxity. So the first was lethargy, where one's mind becomes peaceful and relaxed, but foggy and dull and sleepy. This second problem, that of laxity, the mind here, the object is held appears clearly and can be held for a long period of time, but the mind lacks strength. So these are two. One can fall off the path of actual mindfulness in either of these ways, and that is to be guarded against by being guided by a skilled teacher.
Lolia shared the sewuch na she. Then semlia jamba the zinga delia and the chick zindu bicabla new shoota, new but and arda the shoe yedigenchi, the nachi did win a year, down to get a manyasha comiadi, when it is Chagua and to get Chisan Denigi Yoban, Dikaze do to Diade, Javana, quite Denigi, and then Chigiagia, nobody should church to Gores as it is a Dineza. The Tambanya when come said, and the Lula Miche, Ludi, but Tempechaya, Gan Samata, jumping Udi, Zindu, Nedukabla, you Sudia, Palo de la Sevu, Nadia Cheche. You thinking you look jumping one age, you did Zind by Nubaros and Shuro, you again, Nuba Yudigan, Chigyobaina, that ding on the Tambanya Comiagi, that the name when it is new Chagore.
What one would be striving for is not to fall off in the direction of lethargy or laxity, but rather to practice an actual close placement of mindfulness. And this is then when the object, such as the body, is held without wavering, without a distracted mind, and the object appears clearly. So, with the object being held without distraction, then the mind and the object appearing clearly, that's how we want the object to appear. Then the object possessor or the meditating mind This would have energy and strength. So here, one is not getting tired at all because the mind has energy and strength. Moreover, the object appears clearly. So this is what one wants. And then this would be a practice of a close placement of mindfulness. And when we are practicing well in this way, we should strive to develop this further. This is what we should be striving for, because when one's mind is gaining energy and strength from our meditation, and we are able to hold the object without distraction, the object such as the body and so forth, without distraction, then this is a close placement of mindfulness, and its great purpose for us is that it brings the attainment of actual calm abiding, of single-pointed concentration, ever closer.
And the Demedije Chasa Yore, then Tapaki Tapatiki Chasa, then the Chekang in body, the same down, Toa down, Lu Mayan Kenki, Che Chasa, Nakanishine Dina de Chena Duna, Dina Dushare.
So now let's turn to the manner in which to meditate on the fourth observed object, that of phenomena. So firstly, you recall what is meant by phenomena. We have that on the second page. And there we have, it's all mental factors other than feelings. So all the wide variety of mental factors, the other 50, are included, as well as all other non-associated compounded phenomena, all impermanent phenomena other than matter and consciousness. And thirdly, all permanent phenomena.
Dushe Mayan King, that then they same Gani church there, and then Garanzuki Chebachi do that Saint Chetelia, and this so bene Nyomo Bedic, that Decha said, and Condor said, and Arja said, and Nyomo Bodic Mangushi Kore, this way church Kore, Jizam, and the Niki church, and the men began that, Chikmitawa to be Nijung said, and Chanchu same, Ninji Chimbo said, Dene, and Arzuki Lam Chitame for topic law said, the Sue Church Egorwa. Just that Dene in that, the super, that chair, say Chidang or chair to Shevena, that chair let me, Tamanija Gom, Ladu, that chair Mambu Venana, Arzuki do Stene, that chair Rangi Tingy, the Chi Tingy said, in Caprachin Congo, rather chair let me, Rangi Tingy, the Chi Tingy Gom, that chair Mambu Nane, Chelia Chi, Rangi Tingy Samtavena, Dujigu Chur Kanishi Nada, Tawamang, Dujigu Chur Kanishi, no the Karasan, Gijiki Gudan Gyälwa dinner, Juba, Gudan Gyälwa dinner, Gyetubache, Korongo, Gijiki Chitubachi, Jibingo, Gudan Gyälwa dinner, Gibi Rashin Chiria Shas and Begida, Gudan Gyen, La Dunion, Drutu, Gibi Chiria Shas and Begay, the Korongo in the share, such more Tisamnaira. The more in the share. Dana Dumajiki Chur said, Koron under Jigi Yoba Kashila, Koron Gudan Gyälwa Dune, Gyemoba, Koron, and the Jigi, and your unit to American, and the Jigi Gudan Gyälwa Mato, Gyälwa Mato, Koron, the Daughter Native, Jirashas, and the Nigi said some dida, Koron Zugi, Rangi, Tingy, some Dana Chakruach, Dujigi Chela, Mish, some Mish, Rang, Dujigi Cheti, Rang, Tingy Lamna. Gudan Gyälwa Dune and to get Gyälwa Chile, Gudan Gyälwa Matoba, you have made you Chilla, it's a good killer to give you Russian Chitrisha and did you see Rangatin? Said. The Dumagic Church said, that Rangatin and Gudan Gyälwa Dumoba, Gyemoba, Chikoro, 大多给的呢，有有那这大多业的原因，我的那些下噻，就像的那个什么大的这个让给成一定我说的。
Looking at the close placement of mindfulness on phenomena, the observed object is phenomena, and phenomena are things that exist. So if something exists, it is a phenomenon. And this, we've seen, includes everything that hasn't been presented already. So it includes all consciousnesses that haven't been presented already, all form that hasn't been presented already, actually all form was presented already, so it excludes matter thereby, and it includes permanent phenomena. So that's what is meant by the term, the observed object, phenomena. And the way that we will approach this specifically here is that we can think about phenomena in terms of mental factors that are afflictions, such as anger, attachment, and pride. And we can also think about other consciousnesses which are on the side not of the afflictions, but on the side of virtue, such as reflecting on impermanence, love and compassion, bodhicitta, and the various minds of a path. So all these are included within the observed object of phenomena. And as we saw with the previous three observed objects, one meditates first on the specific characteristics. So we see here that the specific characteristic is the individual entity of each mental factor and so forth. In other words, the individual entity of the phenomenon being meditated on. So if that phenomenon is impermanent, such as a mental factor, then its entity is that it is impermanent because it changes momentarily and it is dependent on causes and conditions. So that is its entity. If the phenomenon is permanent, its entity is that it is unchanging. It doesn't change momentarily, therefore it's permanent, and it is not dependent on causes and conditions. So that's a brief way to talk about the entity of phenomena by dividing phenomena into those which are impermanent and those which are permanent.
Gyälwa Gyälwa ma ru ta par ne de ji re sha san be ge sam ta de ji da da Chögyi Chögyi sha de ne ge rang ge chen yi sam da de sam da ji ro na de ne ge sam da se wi che la da di dian do da pe ne chö sha de do da ji chen yi de jie ba che de xie da zhan bei ge yu qin jie de ne chö de dan chö de la yu dan jin le de ne yu cha ji da yu dan jin la ma de ba an da ba ne de da bei ge cha ji ni ga du de ne ge ni ga de la zhan bei jin ne da de ne ge zhan ba di de do ji chen yi ka che ba che ho le la na da de le mi da ba da du nga wa se de zam da me de da di na de di ga la ka se ne Chögyi na de ji Chögyi ji ba sam da de da di la ka dang ji chen yi ka ro go me se dong wa se de da ka so re dong wa de go ya dong wa da me ba ni de go me de da 사람이 답을 믿어 있나를 말다 최최기 때도 랑이 챙이라도 최디나라 랑이 최디나라 예완이 체제 삼다도 지나 뒤지게 제 규단 길에 되는 게 차지야도 규단 길라마 되바 답을 라신 답을 내려 차지야도 지나 최디나라 되네 니가 촌도 선배 삼다지 랑이 챙이 삼단 거로 다 되네기 예되게 니가게 두디게 되네 예되게 될라다 최야도 최코롱 때도 최코롱의 때도 대 지칭 섬들 미다바 섬다요 마가선 디나 딱바 주디요 봐 진짜 눈와 섬다요 말다 가르 고음고르스네 아니 가서래 다시 상황이 주변 동화 제바지 고미하다 가사 다들 주변 동화인데 지칭이 링이도 고미하
When we're investigating then on the specific characteristics of phenomena, then of those observed object phenomena, we reflect that some phenomena are compounded, which means they come about in dependence on causes and conditions, and that they are impermanent, therefore they change momentarily. Other phenomena, they are uncompounded, and therefore they are permanent, and therefore they do not change momentarily, and they are not dependent on causes and conditions. So that's, as said before, we can class all remaining phenomena, those that were not included in the first three observed objects, we can include them, they are included here in phenomena, and we can divide those into those which are impermanent, those which are permanent, and in this way we've reflected on their entities, that some change momentarily, some do not because they're permanent. Then when we come to meditating on their general characteristics, we take these two classes of phenomena, we bring them together as one. So we bring the impermanent together, we bring the permanent together, and we bring them together into one class of phenomena. Then we come to investigate the general characteristics of phenomena. So we do so of them together, of impermanent and permanent together. And because we're looking at all remaining phenomena, impermanent and permanent together, we don't look at the first two of the general characteristics, impermanent and suffering. We just look at the third and fourth, empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, and selfless. Selfless in terms of lacking a self-sufficient, substantial, existent self. So we bring the impermanence and permanent phenomena together, we investigate their general characteristics of phenomena, all phenomena, but we just look at the third and the fourth general characteristic.
samtana chikchi de rawa mare dene ani garsore keji chiba enza ane majibe tabati mare ani garsore chashe gyune keji ngachi chashe mangmu tyobanza ane jibwa mare disunga chobege chobade mare esne komna samtana chikchi da di chishesa da jigla kargo samtana jigla karesne dene gansa 다바 규단 견라 마두베 라와와 안에 차시라 메두베게 아니 지구와 데네 안에 그 띠누미집에 따바 데네 숨 소드 주베 강사지요 말레스 제가 데네게 강사 디유나 다시 라완지 주베 강사라게 됐어 제가 데네 다시 라완지 주베 강사 디기 롱제자 마두바레 삼다나지 삼다나니요와 류다 초와의 셈라 다시 라완지 주베 동화 검나데라 삼다나데 림바니요와 삼다나니요와 다데데라 안에 당보되어 말다 유단 견라 뛰어반자 안에 가서라 라와 말에 사제 삼다메르고 가서 최셔야지 진짜 최 코로나 삼다데 다 최데 코로나 삼다데 다시 라완지 주베 마두바 동화 삼다나 가레레스네 유단 다시 라완지 주베 강사디게 데네게 다시 라완지 주베 강사게 롱조자 말에 사제 삼다나데다
The third general characteristic of empty, when we investigated the previous three observed objects, the observed object of body, then of feelings, and then of mind, when you investigated them through the general characteristic of being empty, we investigated those three observed objects in the same ways. First, that the observed object itself, for example, the body or feelings or the mind, is empty of being permanent because it changes momentarily. It's empty of being unitary or single because it's dependent on parts. And it's empty of being independent because it is dependent, in particular, dependent on causes and conditions. So therefore, the observed object is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. Moreover, and then the second part of the meditation, the person too is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent for those same three reasons. Therefore, the observed object of, for example, the body, is not utilized by a permanent, unitary, independent person because there is no such person. Likewise, the observed object of feelings, as well as then of mind, is not utilized by a permanent, unitary, independent person because there is no such person. So this is how we did the meditation for the previous three observed objects. It had those two steps. We first looked at how the observed object lacked or was empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. Thereafter, we looked at how the person, too, is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, and therefore, no such person can utilize or make use of the observed object. Now, when we come to phenomena, the observed object of phenomena, of those two ways that one investigates to see whether it's empty or not, one doesn't do the first way, because phenomena here includes both impermanent and permanent phenomena. So one just utilizes the second step of the meditation, investigating the person, seeing whether the person is permanent and seeing that the person is not, because the person changes momentarily, seeing whether the person is unitary and seeing that the person is not, because the person is dependent on parts, and thirdly, seeing that the person is empty of being independent because the person is dependent on causes and conditions. And therefore, because the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, no such person utilizes phenomena. So the second step of the meditation, this meditation we do on the observed object of phenomena, is identical to the second step of the meditation for the previous three observed objects. The fourth general characteristic, that of selfless, here the meditation is done in an identical manner to the previous three observed objects, in that one looks at the self and sees that the self, there is no self that is self-sufficient, substantially existent. In that way one comes to understand selflessness. And then let's read what we've looked at here in terms of the specific characteristic of phenomena. So that's the top of page 4.4. With respect to phenomena, the individual entity of each mental factor and so forth. So that is, what is the specific characteristic of phenomena? It is whatever its individual entity is.
Semjung la soba se de mangbu yore so semjung la soba mangbu yore la yode la de ne zang dang an ju gi da che zhen ban ni xiao gong miao de be ne de xi de ji dang che ji dang sam da je che zhen ban ni xiao gong na xie wa da yang che na lo mangbu yo ba ne de re le sam da je an zu mi ba che che ne che zhen ban ni xiao gong miao be ne du xie le mi xie mi ba du xie le mi xie du xie gi de du ne ka so rang chingina ji chingyi je da ne gong bi xie zhan ba de xie le du lam de che zhan ba ni xie cha go re de ne du xie le mi xie di de rang chingina ji chingyi na da ne gong bi zhan ba ni xie jong che zhan ba ni cha go re re sam da ba na du xie da ane du ka so re semba sia da illa che ba se rakba se ti so re le mi xie ane zhan ba ni xia gong miao yong re di na xin ane ge se nam ka sia de da ba gong sam da je zhan ba ni xia gong miao yong re na de xin an zhe ge ji chen yi dong wa sai jiao ro dong wa da xue rang wan qing tu dong wa sai jiao ro 또 코로나에 미세 잠만 이제 공공에 연구래 인디나시 대신한 저게 다음에 봐서 지승이 다음에 봐 코로나에 미세네 내가 소리 잠만 이제 공유 지들이 최근에지나 코로나에 미세 랑이 생기는 지승이 있다는 거 맞아 유의되어 자고래
The way we've had presented then already is the way to engage in the close placement of mindfulness on phenomena, where one takes impermanent and permanent phenomena, in other words, all phenomena, everything that exists that hasn't already been reflected on in the three previous observed objects, and reflects on them together in the way that was mentioned, their specific characteristic, and then the general characteristics of empty and selfless. So that is the way to engage in this meditation on close placement of mindfulness on phenomena. However, one can and should go into more detail, breaking up or dividing up the observed objects of phenomena into its varying parts or various illustrations. For example, there are 50 mental factors that haven't been covered thus far. There are mental factors other than feelings. So here, one can reflect on discrimination, the mental factor of discrimination, of the mental factor of intention, the mental factor of stabilization, the mental factor of contact, and so forth. So these would be illustrations of impermanent phenomena or of consciousness, mental factors other than feelings. And we meditate on them through their specific characteristic, the individual specific characteristic, and the general characteristics. And one can reflect on permanent phenomena, such as space and empty. So before we had empty of a permanent unitary independent self. Here, as a permanent phenomenon, just reflect on empty. And here, one can reflect on it through its general and specific and then general characteristics.
Semje. Dico mera. Chi barwa da rang sing chi sing de ni ji xie ma. Du ji ina chi sing xi ga sam da yo wa. Mi da ba ko me yo du nga ko da mi ko du ji sa xie ina ji ga ko me yo wa. Da du ma ji na ni ma de ko ya ma wa sam da me ro. Da du xie la bi du ji cha ro wa. Then same ka yila cheba da rakbala de dujing oboro sheba ba chasa je den sa mitaba ko me ye ruwa den ni sa che yin sa jisu den do dunga ko me ye de shiga ko me ye cha ruwa duji gi che sa che gi duji gi che de la.
And when one divides phenomena into individual phenomenon, then if those if each phenomenon is impermanent, then one investigates its specific characteristic and all four general characteristics. So, for example, if it is consciousness, such as the mental factor of discrimination, one investigates its specific characteristic and all four general characteristics. If the phenomenon that is being investigated is a permanent phenomenon, such as empty, then one would investigate its specific characteristic and only two of the general characteristics, that of empty and selfless, because being a permanent phenomenon, it isn't impermanent or in the nature of suffering.
dushi ki same ki dushi chue sheba sugi na sakche same yungure ane sheba ina sakche same yungure deme di jele sakche same yungurwa chesa sakche ki chue kandashi ne sugi na chowa ina ane dushi semjung kandashi ne dushi kandashi ne di tendo rangi tsengi che chi tsengi shiga samta kwa yoba che da dushi ki chue same ki dushi ki chue chiyorwa da pene pakwe gyule yodigin same ki dushi same ki 풍보이나다 수 풍보이나다 초와이나 아니 이제 셈이나 셈 셰바 데메티제 간시네 사메게 뒤지게 취이나 니데도 가르코메어스는 랑이 친이 요바체 지친이네 미다보고메 요바체 동화세 가서 그래 동화고메 요 말에 다 동화다 다음에 뭐 지친이 숨고메 용 거래 사제기 뒤지기 최대라 랑의 생이데 지생이 시가금 삼다여야 되지. 딱과 인간다 뒤지게 많이 딱과 강인 바들라 디데도 랑의 생이 삼다고 매여봐지. 지생이 나네 니마도 삼다면 동화당 안에 다음에 봐 삼다여봐지 고며 디데 다던달에 캬바나 뒤지들라 사셰다 사면이체 사제기 뒤에도 지생이 차상 시가금 매여봐지. 사매기 때도 지생이 숨고며 여봐지 미다바 동화 다음에 봐 숨고며 여봐지 다 딱와 있나 내랑의 생이제 디디의 지생이 니마도 상담해지
This phenomena, the observed object of phenomena includes all existence, then restart that. So when engaging in the four close placements of mindfulness, all phenomena are included. Some within the category of body, some in the category of feeling, some in mind, and the rest in phenomena. So everything that exists is included here. So whether it's the observed object is an object of form, an object of consciousness, or a non-associated compound phenomena, or a permanent phenomenon, we can look at these in terms of, divide them in terms of being contaminated or uncontaminated. And this then has some slight difference in how we approach the meditation. So for all of them, whatever the observed object is, one first investigates its specific characteristic, its entity. Thereafter, one investigates the general characteristics. This procedure doesn't change. Where the change comes is which of the general characteristics one investigates the observed object through. So for most observed objects one will investigate, one will do so through all four general characteristics, but for some, only three, and some only two. If the phenomenon, the observed object that one is investigating, is a contaminated phenomenon, then one is likely to investigate it through all four general characteristics. If it's an uncontaminated phenomenon, such as the feelings in the continuum of an Arya being, the form of an Arya being, the mind of an Arya being, and so forth, so an uncontaminated phenomenon, then one does not reflect on the second general characteristic of suffering, or in the nature of suffering, but the other three of impermanence, emptiness, impermanence, empty, and selfless. So there is a difference. If it's an uncontaminated phenomenon, such as mind or feelings or body of an Arya being, one does not reflect on the general characteristic of suffering, because that object is not in the nature of suffering. And then, if again, as mentioned in the previous segment, if the object is a permanent phenomenon, then one only reflects on the last two general characteristics, empty and selfless. But the majority of objects that one will investigate would be included in contaminated phenomena, contaminated impermanent phenomena. And those one investigates through all four general characteristics.
차산에 사제 체가 말에 디디도 안 가서 동아 와서야 지지 동아 와서야 파바지 수 있는 거야 메르와 니마도 매니 저기 년뒤 안에 지게 파바다 라게 파바 내 자좀바 다 라메 자좀 마토바지 라제 자좀 바다 되네기 매니 절라 통람바다 공람바다 대수 유유 풍보디게라 사제리 풍보 사제 디디 대수 고규수 수기 풍보에 때도 니고미야 가서 동화와 되고미야 예대 버리시 지층이다랑 지층이 시가 삼다 예대 최고래 야 파와세리야 파케바자 세월에 장마 자루와.
And to be particularly clear and repeat what was said in a previous class. So when talking about Arya beings, so we have on one hand Arya Buddhas, but we don't need to look there now. Buddhas are quite special. Let's talk about the other two types of Arya beings, those which are Arya Bodhisattvas and those which are Tibetan Arya beings. So Arya Bodhisattvas all Arya Bodhisattvas, so from the path, the Mahayana path of seeing, and those on the Mahayana path of meditation, their body is not in the nature of suffering, and therefore one would not investigate their body through the second general characteristic of suffering. For ordinary bodhisattvas, those on paths of accumulation and preparation, their body still is contaminated, and therefore one would investigate it through all four general characteristics. So that's bodhisattvas, Arya and non-Arya. Then the Theravada Aryas, whether hearers or solitary realizers, they're Arya beings who, including those who have achieved nirvana, those who are foe destroyers, but still a foe destroyer with remainder. So a foe destroyer with remainder, as well as a solitary realizer or hearer Arya beings, their body is still contaminated. So their body one would investigate through all four general characteristics. The exception is for the Arhat, or the foe destroyer, who's achieved nirvana without remainder. Their body is not in the nature of suffering, and their body then would not be investigated through the general characteristic of suffering. But the Theravada Aryas, including the foe destroyer who has achieved nirvana with remainder, their bodies are still in the nature of suffering. So that's just presenting it in finer detail.
di komi de bene ja semba ka semba ina da nyende ina da cholamba di di komi di damanya komga di cholambe komgo jolambe komgo tonlamba da ngolamba da ne sangye ko ba yunguru wa da ngo yungore ina da sangye cholambe damanya je komba yore jolambe komba yore tonlambe komba gomlambe komba sangye komba yore 밀로 차상게 잠번이 이제 시인지 단 이거 차상 람 냠는 지가 차상게 공부 요르와.
Those who engage in the actual close placements of mindfulness meditations, or those who have achieved a path, and whether they are a hero or solitary realizer or bodhisattva, from the path of accumulation right up to the attainment of their goals, that the final goal even of Buddhahood, all these practitioners, from any of the three types who has achieved a path of accumulation until and including the attainment of the final path of no more training, here the practitioners engage in the actual four close placements of mindfulness.
난 초람바데 얘기 베닝엔드에 있나라 랑자 있나라 전주선바 있나 초람바데 얘기다 잠만이지 시디 쪼치는 공고래 잠만이 시디 쪼치는 공고래.
Those who've achieved a path of accumulation, the first of the five paths, whether of the hero type, solitary realizer type, or bodhisattva type, they primarily engage in the meditation on the four close placements.
다디 조치네 공고래 디니자 다 잠반예샤 시디도 랑게 쳔이다 지쳔이 니나네 제바지 공묘데 디나네 야다 조 라이지 쳔이 다음에 받으라 조 공고르와.
And all three types on the path of accumulation will engage in first the specific, and then the meditation via the specific characteristic, and then the general characteristics. And amongst the general characteristic, the one of their primary focus, primary attention, will be on that of selfless.
And Jamanyesha Zochi, Dinane Ya, and Rangi Tsing Ji Tsing Nane, that Ji Tsing let me be Zochi, the Gongores, Gongorwa, the Gongo Bigusan Sena Cadrelana, Ji Tsing and Dame, but they let me be Shine Solambadigi, Dame Balin and Solambaina, Dame maybe Shine top Mebaina, dame bal mi be shine zo shin du ko shine du ko re dame bal shine du ne shine du ya ge chi de ane ji sing dame ba so de le mi be ge de shine du zo shine to ya chi do be zo chin zo gong ko wa da shine top cha ba ina da dame bal mi be shine top cha ba ina ya de le ya dame bal zo gong ko har sen dame bal mi be la dong to yo ma de je za ma to ba yin sa 신의 디게다 장게 챙이 근데 류래 미마이나 자 미바디 류래 미네 류기도 지챙이 다음에 보고면다 미바디 초와를 미제 디디의 지챙이 다음에 보고면 미바디는 알거소래 셈라 미제 디챙이 디디 지챙이 다음에 보고면 다이 대체자 신의 토비여 봐이나 델야 다음에 지챙이 신의라 미제 가서 다음에 받을 미셈 제지도 띵이 내신병 안에 델야 잠비게 셈디 ane sem chir choma chuba che dembi zin je an dele sherapki dele jeba chi gorwa jeba chi jisan laotong chu gore jisan dine ge komyo de an chi chingi la mi bi go zo go mo jisan di dele mi ne shini shi dame bal mi bi shi lao song de ru go gore jisan di chu ye ge zo go gorwa di ru go ba de kare la ne dame bal mi shi lao song de ma to ba ina nyen de cholam ba de gi 년도 졸람 톱투고 말 세상 거 또와 야기 저거라 년도 졸람 저거 토고고라 또 저거 토고자 다음에 발 미비기 미바디 류라미나다 초알미 셈라미나 쳬라미 미바가리 미베네 디드르 지층에 다음에 바텔라 미신이 토피나 니신이 토비체도 또 배주체 고미하다 신이 토바이나 잼비기 땡제 잼비 진텔리아는 셰르게 제바지 라동 토야기 된다 우두신의 실라송리고 고미하게 토비체도 조 공고를 인장에 대 다음에 지층에는 다음에 바디 조 공고를 세대 김센들이 당아저 태면 바세나다 년도 소람 발랍샤디로와 태진의 년도 소람 바세다 년도 소람 바데아래 가서 란제 소람 바 지바래다
For the Gyälwa and solitary realizer practitioners who have achieved the path of accumulation, they will make great effort in the practice of the four close placements of mindfulness, and they will do so through the four observed objects, and on those four observed objects, whilst they will investigate the specific characteristic of each, as well as the general characteristics, their main energy will be placed on the meditation of selfless in relation to this observed object of this close placement of mindfulness. And they will be doing so, realizing selflessness each time, and then trying to hold that realization of selflessness with calm abiding. Because being on the path of accumulation, they will already have calm abiding, but probably holding only for coarser objects. Now, each time they realize selflessness, they're trying to hold it with single-pointed concentration, with calm abiding. Eventually, through training like this, the subtle object of selflessness, the hero or solitary realizer will be able to hold it with calm abiding. But when they achieve that, they will continue though with this meditation on the four close placements of mindfulness, exactly the same technique through the four various observed objects, reflecting on the specific and general characteristics, but primarily on the characteristic of selflessness. Each time realizing selflessness, holding it with calm abiding, and then trying to investigate further. Because what they're doing here is trying to develop the union of calm abiding and penetrative insight or meditative insight, which is where the object, selflessness, is held single-pointedly without any distraction with calm abiding. And one can investigate, analyze, without losing the object at all. Because usually when one holds an object, one cannot investigate, because then one loses the object. So here they're trying to hold selflessness with calm abiding and investigate. And that takes some training, and eventually they can. And when they can, they have achieved the union of calm abiding and meditative insight, investigating selflessness, whilst holding it single-pointedly, investigating it. And that is the boundary That means the hero or solitary realizer crosses to the second of the 5 paths, the path of preparation. So that is why this is the close placement of mindfulness is a primary meditation for a hero or solitary realizer practitioner on the path of accumulation. And they engage in this meditation principally focusing on the general characteristic of selfless of any of the observed objects.
na tongpa ni doje ane tongpa ni la mi be shila sungri top sarje ane jeju semba meni nyan de jajamba top jene ane deniki ya an tongpa ni la mi shila sungri top sarje ane jeju semba cholam dangbo top to ga ji yung gore di cholam ba di ane ko tongpa ni la mi be jeju semba cholam ba ki shi gore da jeju semba cholam ba mangu yo wa meni jajumbe jibo top sarje jeju semba cholam ba chaga yore jajumba de deniki ga ma she ba je nyen cholam cha cholam ne rig mangu yo wa rig mangu yo ba yanza da meni tongpa ni do char tongpa ni la mi be shi la su de top char ane nyen de jajumbe ko ba top ne ya ne da sa jajumbe ko ba nyen de da ra ye jajumbe jibo top char je an tiasin lam la shu she tiasin cholam ba sa je wa 디 솔람바디기 동반이라 미베실라 손데 톱사바리고 제상코 동반이라 미베실라 손데 조어정 공고 말고 톱사르바 신 동반이라 신의 톱레 동반이라 미베 하동 톱레 제상 동반이라 미실라 손데 톱사바레 ndago ko ne jidang di tamani 샤 공고를 때디 공고를 때 이내 조디가서 거 가르쳐 왔으나 솔람 가서 소남이 초초해야 돼. 다 디가서 자주 셈고미야다. 근데 제 진비냠는 제도 소남이 초데 조를 장고다 조비 디공고래. 지사 디공고마도 그 디텐도 잠반이잖아네. 근데 가서 지친이 다음에 봐서 동반이도 조 공고 말해. 자정 톱차래. 아니 동반이를 미베 실라소를 조 동반이를 미베 실라소를 톱차와서 고고래. 동반이를 미베 실라소를 톱차와래. 지상 톱차와 인장 그 다디 잠만이자 공고를 때네 네 조치네 가서를 지칭이 하는 동반이를 미비게 조의 공고 말하서는 디가 수선은 미소소와서 거래지.
So that's a presentation for the 2 types of Tibetan practitioners on the path of accumulation. And they proceed in the same way. Then on the bodhisattva path of accumulation, here there are a variety of types of bodhisattvas, as we looked at in an earlier class. Different types of bodhisattvas in terms of their lineage, and whether they, because of their lineage, they had come to the bodhisattva path directly or via the Tibetan paths. So let's first look at the type of practitioner who has come to the bodhisattva path of accumulation after having already achieved the state of a hero or solitary realizer, arhat. So he's already achieved the state of a foe destroyer. Thereafter, he has generated bodhicitta and has now entered newly into the bodhisattva path of accumulation. Now, such a practitioner who has already completed the Tibetan paths and has achieved the level of foe destroyers, has completely abandoned the afflictions together with their seeds, now has entered the bodhisattva path of accumulation. This bodhisattva does not need to focus on meditating on selflessness, trying to get hold of the calm abiding and thereafter with penetrative insight, as they have already done this. They have already achieved the Tibetan path, completed it, and are achieved the state of foe destroyer. So they already have a union of calm abiding and meditative insight, realizing selflessness. So on their path of on their Mahayana path of accumulation, their primary focus is on accumulating merit, and this is done through meditating on bodhicitta, generosity, and so forth. So, for the bodhisattva on the path of accumulation who has come there via the Theravada attainment of arhatship, they on the bodhisattva path of accumulation primarily focus on accumulating merit through meditating on bodhicitta and generosity and so forth, because they already have a union of calm abiding and meditative insight, realizing selflessness.
Dene Geshe Senpa Tsolamba Jige Dongpa le Mibigi Shila Sunde Nyele Matova Bene Jajumbi many Tamangi Jajumbi Topa Topsawa in a Dongpa le Mibi Shila Sunde to Mebigi, Dene Matovangi, Nin Jajumba, Denigi Ayungore, Teso and Ya Teslam Tesho Solamba said. And the Membigeda Chikmanigi Tamangi Lamkayang, Majevajan, Tesson Solemn shooting the Nigi Solamba Tigi. Da garu kutu kora sena da de tongpa ni la mi pege chamba ni ja komyo de an di tendo mi pa lu da semna sowa kar chebe na di tendo tongpa ni to ka so ji chen tongpa ni de la mi pege shine tongpa ni la de la mi pe shine tu bia zo be je komya da tembe den je shine tu bia da de ne shine tu chwe je la ya ya tembe den de shine di nga ne tongpa ni la mi pe la dong tu bia da den shi de da ba se ne让个成绩的基层的基层东巴尼的做功课了吧？东巴尼功课了些。真是什么个基层有个面的做东巴尼的些活的，真是什么的，这些年现在的基层东巴尼的。German Dalabin Tigro, the Dame said, Kansa Dame, that Janjusin Bake up Shedu, G. Tini, the Dame said, don't buy it or she order. Dame Gongor, the Nozo, don't buy you Gongor, don't G. Tini, don't buy you. She's a Dame of Gongor, Gongor, she's a Dame of Gongor in a Zo Carlos, don't buy you, let me be she lost on the Togora, she's a G. Tini, so don't buy you this Chikore.
The other bodhisattvas on the path of accumulation, they have not achieved the state of Theravada foe destroyer, of Theravada arhat. So therefore, on their path of accumulation, they will meditate primarily on the four close placements of mindfulness, on the specific characteristic of any of the four observed objects, and thereafter on the general characteristics of the observed object. There is, though, a difference here in terms of how they approach the general characteristics from what we've heard previously. So they reflect on the observed objects' impermanence, suffering, empty and selfless, but primarily they focus on the emptiness of the observed object. So just to be clear, the Theravada practitioner on the path of accumulation will primarily focus on the general characteristic of selfless. The bodhisattva on the path of accumulation will primarily focus on the general characteristic of emptiness. So the bodhisattva will meditate on all four general characteristics, but in addition will primarily focus on emptiness. So that is a key difference. Then the way they proceed on the path of accumulation is the same as for the hero or solitary realizer on their path of accumulation. They will realize emptiness, try to hold it with calm abiding, because they would have already achieved calm abiding, but probably on a coarser object, already achieved calm abiding in order to achieve a path of accumulation. Now they will, each time they realize emptiness, they will try to hold it with calm abiding. Eventually they'll be able to do this. But then, whilst holding the realization of emptiness, with calm abiding, they won't be able to investigate without losing calm abiding. So therefore they will try to do so until they achieve the union of calm abiding and meditative insight on the object the subtle object of emptiness. Because here, just like with the Tibetan practitioners, this is the bridge to cross to the path of preparation. The bridge, again, is the union of calm abiding and meditative insight on the subtle object of emptiness.
다등이 시에디 랑규비기 시당 로치레 랑규비 소나 로치고레 제가 랑규비기 가르송고레세네 매니 년도 초람단 줄람기 내가수 지천이 고미에 다음에 봤어야 랑게 투비스 수주비 동화세 다음에 봐도 공고레 제레 대대 지천이 디조 공고레가 다 장주선바 남기 초람기 값소 아니 지천이 고미에 저데 지당 가사랑게 지수주비 동화 다음에 봐도 공고레 조 가르서는 동반이 공고레 지천이 동반이 지고레 미티 공고레세 디소나디 디타팅이 때듯이 딜링이 시에 되는 디고르는 시에마 디소나데 랑규비 소나레 나 텐규보 그런 게 송다 집에 텐규블루 제바이나 매니기 가소레 년에 솔람바다 란제 솔람바 제시 솔람바 숨가기 지진이 조 공면의 동반이 되라 랑시 집에 또 비추게 다음에 동반이 조 공고레 이나 랑기도 집에 동화세를 공고를 베스는 공고를 이네 조 그래서는 솔람바 년에 솔람바다 란제 솔람 제시 솔람바 차상기 지진이 조 실라 손제 주위에 지진이 동반이 바지바레 지바 텐규블루라
What I've been presenting here is in accordance with the Svatantika Madhyamaka tenet. It's the Svatantikas who will differentiate between how the practitioners of the hero and solitary realize a lineage on the path of accumulation, what they primarily meditate on, that of selflessness, the general characteristic of selfless, and bodhisattvas on the Mahayana path of accumulation, who will primarily meditate on emptiness. So this differentiation is made by the Svatantika Madhyamakas. The Prasangika Madhyamakas, on the other hand, they don't make that differentiation. They say that all practitioners, whether of the hero lineage, of the solitary realizer lineage, or of the bodhisattva lineage, will primarily focus here on the emptiness, on emptiness, or, to express it differently, the selflessness of phenomena. Whichever lineage or practitioner they are, they will focus, they'll meditate on the specific characteristic of the observed object, on the four general characteristics that we have here, impermanent, suffering, empty and selfless, but primarily on emptiness or selflessness of phenomena. That is the Prasangika view.
And that many Jeramawana, Dodebaina, Chivade, Dame Batimado, Tomba Yishigo Marakasore, Ranja to visit to Ton Chis, Yandu Solambada, Jesu Simba, Solambada, and the Ranja Solamba, Chasan Chivade, Chis, you come at the Ranja to visit to Ton de Yandu Jeramada, Dodebaina. 지사 전주심비 초람바 세다 년도 초람바 랑제 초람바 숨라 지친이 고미에디 지버레 그 랑제 투비스로 동안 마도 현다요 말에 저어디래 레규에 등에 전주심비 초람바 년도 초람바 랑제 초람바 숨가라 지친이 고미에디 가사 랑제 투비스로 동안에 마도 현다요 말에 개발요 말 지버레지 that thank you bala 동방이 지버레 마도 랑제 투비스 기시요 말 다들 오말라
Of the tenet school, so that was the Madhyamaka school with its two divisions, the Svatantika and Prasangika, and their different understanding. Two other tenet schools, those are the Vaibhashika and Sautantika, they state that all three types of practitioners, all three lineage of practitioners, hero, solitary realizer, and bodhisattva, also meditate primarily on the same general characteristic, but that general characteristic is selfless, the characteristic of selfless. They don't talk about emptiness, they make no reference to emptiness at all, it's not something they present. So Vaibhashika and Sautantika, or the Great Exposition School and the Sutra School, they say that the three lineages of practitioners primarily meditate on the general characteristic of selfless.
The same Zambale just covering gore. And then Yendu Solambata, Ranjo Solambini also cheats in your community, Ranjo to be distributed on Comdate. That changes about Solambati cheats in your community and then Chigitame, Chigitame. Semzaba or Semtabeshe, and the changes about Solambati cheats in your community or the Chigitame mean. That thing you bought at Jibache, in that Tongmani Shadan Karamato. The same the Megalosan changes about Solambica so and Chigita, the cheats in your Chigitame, Miche. Many Yandu Solambada, Ranjo Solambani, and cheese and yet Ranjo to be the stone of the Delamito more reset.
Then the final school, the Chittamatrans, or the mind only, they say something similar to what we've already heard, that the two Tibetan lineages, the hero and solitary realizer, will meditate on the specific characteristic and the four general characteristics of each observed object, focusing on primarily on selfless, the self or the person being empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent. So that they say. And they say the Bodhisattva, though, has a different primary focus. The Bodhisattva will meditate on the specific characteristic and the four general characteristics of the observed object, but they will primarily focus on the selflessness of phenomena.
So same church like me, the rank singing teaching Daniel Gomje and Jamaica Comda di Corting and to hit that DNC that the Shesarwa.
So now we've looked at the first outline, that of observed objects, as well as now most of the second outline, the way to perform this meditation on the four observed objects through each observed object's specific characteristic, as well as its four general characteristics. So this is the shared or common way to meditate on the four close placements of mindfulness.
Lula samtang zu ludi kan shesha sambe lu yongo di ane jik samta jesa lu yongo di da duting chobe choba chi le tuba chi re de han jik kichi jibe ra shi re do de jik ane tembo taba tembo bindo sambe samta ya da andi ni ge samta ne da nga zu lu mi she lu di ya ane kar so re ne jik kichi jibe ra shi re jesa da dunga wa sa di Gyu leda nyomo bale tene jungi ki chimare insta dunga ware do gyu leda nyomo tene jumare ta ngo kane sesene ane nga kasa tasho rangwa chi tu tongare kasan gyu dan kyen le tene kyewa insa rangwa mendo tene ane kichi ji ru do wa de insa tapa timbo re mendo tene insa ta gyun phumbo de chashe mongbo tyo ba insa tene jup tyo ba chashe la ma de jibu de re mendo wa sambe ke samta tene samta Denige samdane da nga ju phungbo dia tikje nga chika kansa gyudan kien chashe kala ma rangu ngene drupti wi kansa ki long chuje ki kansa dini chi meba de dini meba za kansa di peche ta long chuje ri mi do was dini inza da nga ju andu che samdane da ganje le dinige samdane yu jiza da nga ju phungbo di karesene 레다 녀모 둥어 라시 제도 텔레테 탈고구도와 선비게 탈두게 삼바기야다 지산 디 타야게 된다라 아 저기 디테도 지산 아 풍보셔야디 규단健康라마도 랑응어디 두백다 간사치 요마레 지산 디네 간사게 다디 론주제 마두바레 디네 요레 선비 진비로디다 로 로셰리도 다진세디도 선비게 다 디네게 삼다이데 아 저기 지산 디방고도 디방방바이는 Tarbas Togore, Dini, Dipaya Dondala Pesuchi, Yen Sembege. Cesatanga to Ludi, Mitaba Inza, Tapa Timbu Mevas, and Gidina near Yomar, Desa, Nimishik Meva Chadures, Cesanga Datanga to Ludi Yebi Kabla, Ditolia, Gejor Tuyata, Jingyam Gyälwa Tuyata, Dipo Poya, Pesuchango, Pesuche Udu, Sembege, and do send some diet, the Chagurbadan.
The way then for ourselves to meditate on this topic is to take then, for example, the first observed object, that of the body. So one reflects first on its specific characteristic, the entity of the body being that it's comprised of elements and composites of the elements. So that here we look at the various compounds or elements of this body. Thereafter we reflect on its four general characteristics, reflecting that it is impermanent because it changes momentarily. This means this body that we value so is unstable, it's unreliable, it's degenerating moment by moment. Moreover, it is in the nature of suffering, and it is so because it was attained due to contaminated karma that had been accumulated due to the afflicted minds. And therefore, because it came from causes, and those causes are contaminated, this body is in the nature of suffering, which means as long as we have this body, we will experience suffering. Thirdly, this body is empty of being permanent because it changes momentarily. It's empty of being unitary because it's dependent on parts. It's empty of being independent because it's dependent on causes and conditions. Fourthly, the person is not self-sufficient, substantially existent. And because no such person that is self-sufficient, substantially existent exists, our body is not utilized or used by such a person. So that's how we meditate on the four general characteristics, and then in conclusion in the meditation, we recognize that it is a wrong consciousness that perceives the self to be self-sufficient, substantially existent. It's a wrong consciousness that relates to the self as if it were the body. It's a wrong consciousness it's wrong consciousnesses that relate to the body as being permanent, as being unitary, as being independent. And therefore, those wrong consciousnesses can be abandoned. And because this body is impermanent, we must utilize what remains of this life well to overcome these wrong consciousnesses, and thereby come to abandon this true suffering, which is our body. This afternoon, then, we'll continue with the text, and we'll look at the uncommon way to meditate on the four close placements of mindfulness. And or to express that differently, we'll look at the unique way that bodhisattvas engage in this meditation. Thank you very much.